Now we want to take a brief look at the healing ministry of Paul and asking the question, first of all, was Paul someone who healed? In the book of Acts, Paul is frequently presented by Luke as a healer. Paul performs some of the same kind of healings as Jesus did. We mentioned when looking at Acts that Paul heals a lame person, and Paul raises someone who has fallen out of a window and has died, and he raises him from the dead. And there can even be a mere contact, like touching Paul, a handkerchief that Paul had touched, could heal someone. So Paul is seen in Acts as a healer, and he heals both those who are believers as well as non-believers. Matter of fact, one of the last stories that is told about Paul is when he is on a place and he heals the father of someone who is a ruler on an island, and he heals that man, and that father has no indication that he is a believer. So healing is not just restricted to those who are believers. In 1 Corinthians, Paul references having performed for the Corinthians signs, wonders, and miracles. Now that's kind of the same language that we see occurring in Acts when Luke is describing the kinds of miraculous, wondrous, and healing activities of the apostles. And for Paul, reminding the Corinthians that they had seen these performed by him is an indicator of his apostleship. So that's the main reason that he makes reference to them. However, in Paul's letters, even though Luke presents him as a healer, Paul frequently indicates people who he knows who are sick, including himself. There's a famous passage in 2 Corinthians 12:7 where Paul has a thorn in the flesh. Now, there's been lots of speculation about what this thorn in the flesh actually was. Is it something psychological rather than physical? But we don't know what it is. But because of the use of the word flesh and how Paul uses that term in other places, many scholars are of the conclusion that it is some kind of physical ailment that he has. We don't know the exact nature of it. Some have speculated that it may have something to do with his eyesight, since when he, in the book to the Galatians, he mentions about ending that letter with his own handwriting and see the large letters, and that the large letters are an indication that he had poor eyesight. There's a tradition outside of the Bible about Paul as an older man and having bandy legs. We don't know what the nature of the bandy legs is, the extent of it. So, but Paul wanted this physical ailment to be removed, and he beseeched Jesus. He prayed to Jesus for it to be removed, but he basically received an answer that it was as a part of the will of Jesus that he endures with this weakness, this limitation in his life. And so Paul couldn't just heal himself of a physical ailment. We even know that some of Paul's closest associates, Timothy and Epaphroditus, aren't healed by him. Timothy is mentioned in the pastoral letters. In 1 Timothy, Paul mentions that Timothy has a stomach problem, and that it's okay for Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake. So Paul didn't heal Timothy of his stomach issue. And Epaphroditus is mentioned in the book of Philippians, and he is someone who's come from the Philippians to see Paul and to bring a message and maybe gifts from the Philippians to Paul. And when he arrives to Paul, he is very sick, and Paul says he almost nearly died, but that God healed him. So Paul wasn't the one who laid hands on him or did something to heal him. It was through God's intervention. So Paul sees that as a kind of an answer to prayer, but nothing that he himself did. So there wasn't a miraculous healing of Epaphroditus. So healing for Paul always remained under the authority of God through Christ and the Holy Spirit. So this was not something he could just do on a whim, just if he wanted to, but it's whether or not God permitted it or God granted it, whether it was in line with the will of Christ, and always it would have to have been done with the aid of the Spirit. The Spirit is the power of God by which these things are achieved or accomplished. Now, there is one other thing about Paul and this activity of healing, and that's in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about gifts of healing. He mentions gifts in the plural of healing, 1 Corinthians 12:9. And what's kind of interesting about this is that these gifts might not be supernatural. In other words, kind of a miraculous healing on the spot. Since the healings are distinguished from miracles, which in verse 10. So some people have one of these gifts of healing, and some people have the gift of performing miracles. So a healing doesn't necessarily have to be a miracle. Paul may have in mind a variety of healing activities. Maybe he has healings that are accomplished by touch or by word or by medicine. So different ways in which people heal. Maybe certain people can heal certain diseases and other people can heal other kinds of diseases or deformities or problems. So it's kind of vague. Paul's interest here in 1 Corinthians 12 is not to kind of unpackage what all these gifts look like, but he's recognizing the diversity of gifts that are present within the congregation in Corinth. For Paul, he's primarily thinking about abilities, and since this is directed towards Christian community, he has the church in mind, and that these different gifts that he lists in 1 Corinthians 12 are things that people do in order to encourage those who have faith. So we don't really have any place where Paul talks about a gift of healing that is used for non-believers, that a Christian has a gift of healing to treat a non-believer. But since Paul himself did heal non-believers, it doesn't seem out of the question that he might not have also conceived that one of these gifts of healings could be used for non-believers. Though in 1 Corinthians 12, it's just primarily focused on those who have faith. And so that's a little bit of a touch into looking at Paul and the concept of healing in his ministry.